predators are one thing, but predatory people, other tribes, man, they're brutal. They're brutal. What about your predatory friend? Oh, that's pretty bad too. The friend who stabs you in the back, the person who betrays you. Well, how about when you betray yourself? Oh, yeah. Well, what's the ultimate predator? What's the ultimate predator? What's the enemy you harbor in your own heart who hates you? That's the ultimate predator.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, welcome to the show.
All right, Chris. Good to see you.
How's the tour going?
It's going great. It's the crowds are well-dressed, extremely positive, there for good reasons, apolitical in the best sense of the word, welcoming. The theaters are packed. The lectures are going well to extremely well. The time I spend afterwards meeting people it's like being in a wedding celebration. I would say that's the closest thing I could.
What do you mean?
Well, you go to a wedding and you meet all sorts of people you don't know, generally, and everyone's happy to be there, and they're all looking good because they dressed up for the occasion, and it's a positive event, and that's the closest analogy that I can think of that would describe what's happening. And people that are there because they're trying to put their lives together, and they are putting them together, and it's working, and so everything about it is as positive as it can be, fundamentally. So, yeah, it's going great.
I saw you took a trip to the Tesla factory. What were your thoughts after meeting Elon Musk? Did you get to speak to him much?
I wouldn't say much. We spoke probably for 20 minutes in total, not purely privately because there's other people around, but that just barely gets you to know the surface of someone like Musk, because he's an amazing person, and God only knows what's up with him, all things considered. We saw his new truck. He was taking people out for a ride. I didn't go out for a ride. The truck's an amazing piece of engineering. The factory is massive. What do you say about someone who built a functional electric car and then shot it into space on a rocket? He's a singular person. But I thought it went very well. It was a very interesting evening. So I was pleased to be there, and we sort of walked around each other a bit, and it was just fine.
You guys interact a fair bit on Twitter.
We seem to, yeah.
What do you think that is? Why are you converging?
I don't know exactly. We're both well known, and I suppose to some degree that increases the probability of that kind of convergence. But maybe he's aiming up. Me too. He seems to be.
He's aiming up literally. He's aiming up very literally, yeah.
Definitely.
Didn't he put wasn't there a model of a spaceman in the driver's seat of the car that he put out into space?
Oh, that's certainly possible. He's got a theatrical twist. There's no doubt about that. And a great sense of humor, because that's really funny to shoot your own car out into space on a rocket.
Needlessly.
That's a pretty damn good joke.
Why is it that someone like Elon has got himself to the stage where he can say things that almost every other CEO, he's the richest man on the planet.
I don't think he's got himself to that stage. I think he's always done that, and so now he still knows how to do it. I mean, people think, I'll say what I have to say when I get to the point where I'm protected and secure. It's like, first of all, being protected and secure does not give you the courage to say what you have to say. That theory couldn't be more backwards. You think you're going to get braver and braver as you get more and more protected? You think that's how the world works? I mean, I've watched university professors think that at some point they're going to say what they think as they develop their career, but by the time they're protected and secure, they've spent so much time not saying what they think that they aren't even who they were, and they don't know what they think. So, no, he says what he says because he's always done that. And people who are like him are like that. And so Steve Jobs, I presume, was exactly the same way. I mean, I know people who knew him. He always said what he thought, and he was pretty damn cut and dried about it, which is why the Apple products are such miracles of technological mastery. He had an unbelievably canny design eye and was he cut whole projects without a second thought in some sense when they weren't working.
He did that when he came back to Apple the second time. Refined the entire product line, got rid of a ton of different things, and so we're focusing on this. Yeah,
right. So that was proof. I mean, maybe it was fluke the first time, which it wasn't, but coming back and doing it again the second time showed pretty clearly it wasn't fluke.
Same with Elon, right? He's refined down what he does to a couple of very, very tight parameters.
Well, he seems to have, although the enterprise he's put together is unbelievably high functioning. I mean, to produce an automobile sub-industry that's actually competitive, and to bring down the cost of space exploration by a factor of 10, and to invent reusable rockets, and to have developed this boring technology. It's miraculous. He's probably an alien.
Yeah, probably.
Probably. Yeah.
There's only two
Probably a reptilian, isn't
American car companies, I think, that haven't gone bust. Ford and Tesla. And Tesla came very close a number of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an amazing accomplishment. Go Elon, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, he's a remarkable person.
What color skin emoji do you use?
If I used one, it would be black.
Why?
Why not? It's so preposterous, all of that. You know, everything that's happened to Rogan, all this idiocy around race, this insistence that we can be reduced to our race, our ethnicity, our sexual identity. It's so appalling, and it's so destructive. I mean, one of the reasons that I had a lot of reasons for making my political stance in relationship to Canada's compelled speech laws. I had a lot of reasons for making my views about that known. One of them was the fact that my government had introduced a bill that required me to say things a certain way, which was an unparalleled move in the history of Western democracies, and something the Americans had made strictly unconstitutional, I believe, in 1942. So that was part of it. Part of it was I knew that this top-down mandated belief that confusion around gender identity was a positive, provide that freedom, let's say. I knew that for every person that saved, that would doom 1,000 people, primarily girls, to a kind of psychological contagion as confusion about sex and gender identity ramped up. I knew the literature on psychological contagion. It's quite.
What is that? What's psychological
detailed.
Contagion?
You could think about them as psychological epidemics. So the last one of any real size was the satanic daycare scares in the 1980s. You're probably not old enough to remember that, but the longest sentences in U.S. criminal justice history were handed out often to women who were accused of late onset female sexual predation of children in daycare centers. The FBI invented a whole new category of perpetrator, a category that didn't exist, because there are no late onset female sexual child sexual predators. They don't exist. But there were women who obtained prison sentences of several hundred years for hypothetically being involved in these satanic daycare abuse rituals. And it just swept across the whole country like the Salem witch trials, except at a much larger scale. There's a book called Satan's Silence that was written by a lawyer and a social worker that documents it. It's just unbelievable. There were stories about underground tunnels where children were being taken down and being, well, every possible thing you could think of was happening to them, all in the name of like satanic ritual. It was a contagion. And those things happen. It happened with cutting behaviors. It happened with eating disorders. This is almost all among girls, because teenage girls are most prone to this. They called it hysteria back in Freud's time, but there's a book by a man named Henry Ellenberger called Discovery of the Unconscious that traces back psychogenic epidemics to about 300 years. And I knew that, people in adolescence, especially people of a certain personality configuration, have some trouble settling into a stable identity. And for a variety of reasons, it can be high negative emotion, which is associated with low self-esteem. Those are more or less the same thing. And then, in all likelihood, high trait openness, which is the creativity dimension. And the high trait openness people, they're the ones that are more likely to have green hair and red hair and lots of piercings and lots of tattoos and dress in a non-standard manner, let's say. That's all associated with creative behavior. And they have trouble catalyzing a single identity. And then if you throw in categorical confusion, which is exactly what you're doing when you declare that there's, an endless number of gender identities, then people who are prone to identity dissociation and to psychogenic contagion, you're going to demolish them.
There is an obsession.
Abigail Schreier has documented that quite nicely in her book, Irreversible Damage. And it's way more girls than boys. And It's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So you think, well, perhaps a few people who are transgender benefited from this new reality, but for everyone who's benefited, and I'd like to see the data just showing how much they actually benefited. But that'll take a long time to accrue. There's 1,000 people who've been just demolished by this. And then what else that's basically that on the political front. I could see all that coming. I talked to the Canadian Senate about it when they put in the legislation. They didn't listen. They just thought racism, bigotry, sexism. It's like, yeah, have it your way. But, so what, all these girls that have rapid onset gender dysphoria and are disfiguring themselves and taking hormones and, wreaking havoc with themselves and their families and the broader culture. These people that were so woke and so permissive, you think they're going to have that on their conscience? They're on to something, some other noble venture. So,
give me your thoughts on the modern dating market.
Well, I'm too old to really have any thoughts on it in some sense.
Not from a personal perspective.
Well, I don't understand it at a level of detail. I do know some things that are happening perhaps at universities where there are far more girls than boys, or women than men. What happens in those institutions, this is what it looks like anyways, possibly. So females are hypergamous, which means they'll mate across and up hierarchies, socioeconomic hierarchy, but competence hierarchy is really at the bottom of it. And so when you set up a situation where there's far more women than there are men in a given domain, say where mate selection can take place, most of the men still don't do very well because most of them are still rejected by women. But a small minority of men do extraordinarily well if you think well means unlimited sexual access. And so what's happening in the universities is that a small minority of men have sexual carte blanche in some sense. And most men are in the same position that most young men are always in, which is they're in a state where they're not particularly desirable to women. And then the women, of course, are terribly frustrated because the minority of men that they would really like to have long-term relationships with, it's a seller's market for those men.
They're not settling down. That's the sex ratio hypothesis.
Yeah.
And the reverse happens, right? That you see whoever the more scarce sex is gets to determine the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. So the men, if they are in high demand because mm-hmm. there's short supply, mm-hmm. you get more short-term mating.
Yeah.
You get increase in relationship dissatisfaction from women. And when the reverse happens, you get more dates before sex. Mm-hmm. You get more long-term mating. You also get more sexual violence in that situation as well, when there is a surplus of men and a scarcity of women. But I think there's something...
You also get far more unstable societies. I was pilloried a few years back for my comments about enforced monogamy because they were taken out of context and twisted in exactly the way that things like that get twisted now. But
what did you mean by that?
I mean that one human universal is the construction of societies to both mandate and reward monogamy. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's because it's the best long-term solution, fundamentally. But one of the reasons for that is that when women are scarce, men get violent. Now, that was read to say, well, I thought that this society should be distributing women to undeserving men, which is, of course, absolutely and utterly preposterous and bears no relationship whatsoever to anything I ever said or thought, or anything anyone sane would ever think or say, or has ever thought or said. Because I don't know anyone politically ever who was insane enough to think that the state should distribute women to men. Like, that's just never happened. So to be accused of that belief and then for that to, be put forward as a credible representation of what I thought was just one of the preposterous things that has happened to me.
It's an unfortunate name, enforced monogamy, because it's a term from anthropology, right? But what you mean is culturally celebrated monogamy, culturally and norms that are supporting people and raising that up as an institution.
Supporting and punishing, both, but mostly supporting. I mean, the punishing is that there's a moral disapproval applied to, say, cheating, right, to adultery, to especially running around behind your partner's back if you're married, particularly that. But even if you're in a long-term stable relationship, It's like, well, that's all enforcement. It's not police with jackboots, but that's not the only type of enforcement. It's not the only type of sanction or threat or punishment or disappropriation or disgust or contempt or shame or frustration or disappointment, all of those things. And all of that, because monogamy is a good long-term solution, but in some sense a troublesome short-term solution, if you have other options, then all of those elements of social support, let's say, need to be put into place. And that is it, as far as I've been able to determine by looking at the anthropological literature. Norms surrounding monogamy are a human universal. There are exceptions, but there are very specific situational reasons for those exceptions.
Do you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30? So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, so this is somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. You know, the first lie is there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? And hey, fair enough, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. I worked as a daycare way back when, that was like 1980, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. And I worked for social services in Alberta in the childcare department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most single most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms, high-end law firms, and said, send us your most productive people, and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people, because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30. And all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this, because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? Just being greedy capitalists is enough. They don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They're in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, and it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you.
But the problem that you have now is that as women are getting better educated, with more employment, more status, more prestige, they compete themselves out of their ability to find an attractive mate. As women raise up through the dominance hierarchy, and this is...
Competence hierarchy,
sorry.
Okay.
Who's going to tell women the equal access to opportunity that you have recently just acquired? Actually, what that's doing is it's making it more difficult for you to find a mate that you're fundamentally attracted to.
Yeah, well, it does a lot of things. I mean, it does provide women with a lot more opportunity on the economic front. It does decrease their dependency on their mate in relationship to economic security. And educating women, countries that are willing to educate women, that's the best predictor of their future economic success. So if you look at developing countries and you want to find out what about a developing country is most likely to predict the fact that they will continue to thrive economically, it's their attitude towards the education of women. And a couple more things. Women's educational status predicts their children's educational status, but men's educational status doesn't. So that's also an important multi-generational effect. I released a video. I was going to conclude that other story. I released a video, or someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies? And I wasn't being judgmental. I was just saying exactly what I said to you, which is, well, I've watched women over the entire course of my life with, I would say, an affectionate eye. I love my sister. I love my wife. I have a daughter. I love my mother. I'm pretty happy about women, all things considered. I don't have an axe to grind in relationship to how they should conduct their lives. I don't even know how they should conduct their lives. I've watched what happens. And I've also watched what happens to women who hit 29 or 30 and then can't conceive. And that is not fate I would wish on anyone. It's awful. And 30% of couples fall into that. 30% of couples have difficulty conceiving. It's a lot. And the probability that you'll have difficulty conceiving increases with age. And so, c'est la vie. But it's very interesting to me to see how vitriolic those comments have been and how uniform that is, because usually on my YouTube channel in particular, 95% of the comments are positive. And this is completely the opposite of that. So you brought this up at the beginning. You said 50% of women now at 30.
50.1 are childless by 30.
Yeah. Well, that's not good. That's a sign of something profoundly wrong with the entire culture at an extremely deep level.
I don't think that women need to take it as us trying to tell women what they should or shouldn't do, but I think that it would be very fair to say that you need to be an incredibly unique woman to make it to 50 without a family and look back and think, yeah, I did this right. That's not to say that those women aren't out there. They absolutely are. I know some of them. But I think overall that it's...
it's the same with everyone, for everyone. I mean, this is another example of how our culture has just lost its moorings. It's like, well, what's life? Well, you have a job or a career, and hopefully you're productive and you contribute something to the community and you provide yourself and your family with the necessities of life. That's a quarter of your life or a third of it, something like that. You have an intimate relationship, you have a family. That's life. And if you don't have one of those, that's 1/3 of your life you don't have. Now, some people, maybe they're doing so well on the other two fronts that they can cope with not having that. Or maybe they're doing so well on one front, they can cope with not having two of them.
Compensates.
Yeah, maybe. It's pretty hard because if you want to have a great career, it's hard to do that if you're alone and without a family, right? I mean, the people that I've seen who've been best situated in their life, all things considered, even in relationship to their career, have a pretty solid monogamous relationship that stabilizes them. And then they have a family that also stabilizes them and broadens out their life. And, you know, exceptional people do exceptional things, and good for them, but they're, by definition, given that they're exceptional, they're a tiny minority. This is always the argument between conservatives and liberals, right? Because the liberal types, they're more tilted sometimes towards, what would you call it, compassion or appreciation for the exceptional. And fair enough, the exceptional is necessary, but on average, what everyone does on average is the thing to do. And so you just look, you see, well, what do people do? Well, they have a job or a career, they have an intimate relationship, and they have a family. And if you don't have any one of those things, well, then you're treading water harder. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And it doesn't even mean possibly that you shouldn't try, but as a default presumption, it's just utterly foolish. What else are you going to do with your life? Well, maybe you're wildly creative. Fair enough, you know. That's extraordinarily rare as well, subject to the power law problem in any case, which is even if you're hyper creative, the probability that you're going to be successful at that economically is extremely, extremely tiny, to the point where it's almost non-existent. It's so difficult. Now, it does happen, and you can have spectacular success if you become successful. But
wasn't it that did you say last night, of the 100,000 most recently printed books, only 1,000 have sold more than 1 million?
Yeah, it's something like that. It's something like
Power law's all the way down.
Yeah, everywhere. Power law, that's, you know, a tiny minority of people do all the work. A tiny minority of people get all the benefit. A tiny minority of athletes score all the goals. A tiny minority of men get all the women, etc. A tiny minority of stars have all the mass. A tiny minority of rivers have all the water. A tiny minority of cities have all the people, etc., etc., etc. Everywhere, always. You know, and we're so clueless in our culture that we blame that on capitalism. It's like, how does that account for the mass of stars, people? So, or the, you know, the volume of rivers, or the population density of cities, or...
Rolling the clock forward, you and Elon tweeted recently about population collapse. What do you think is going to happen there?
Oh, well, I've thought for at least 10 years that the biggest problem in 50 years will be that there's just not enough people.
I remember hearing you say a few years ago that you thought we'd peak at about 9 billion.
Yeah, we probably won't hit 9. Yeah. And I knew the stats because...
Think about how crazy it is to think that we might be living on Earth right now at a time with the most number of humans that are ever going to exist at one time ever.
Yeah, that's highly probable. And, you know, and the population...
That blows my mind.
The population collapse in developed countries is precipitous, right? It's like we fall off a cliff.
Because it's the same as everyone knows this from the pandemic, the R0 number. If fewer people are reproducing, next generation you have fewer people to reproduce as fewer people are reproducing.
Yeah.
And
well, I worked on a UN committee, it's got to be 10 years ago now, to help draft the UN Secretary General's report on sustainable economic development. And so I looked at all sorts of things like that. I was very curious, for example, about, because people have been beating the overpopulation drum since, well, it really kicked in the 1960s, you know, because there were dire predictions. By the year 2000, the Club of Rome came out and said, well, there'll be riots and mass starvation and mass movement of migrants and all the things you hear about climate change because there's too many people on the planet. And that just didn't happen at all. That was just, that it wasn't just wrong, it was anti-true. It was absolutely wrong. What happened instead was that everyone got way richer, and the bottom section of the population in terms of economic distribution got lifted out of poverty. Inequality still exists, but that's that power law phenomenon we already talked about. Not that that's trivial, it's just unbelievably difficult to determine what to do with. There are solutions, but certainly getting rid of capitalism isn't the solution. And so I looked at population trends and first of all found, not that this is an act of genius or anything, that as soon as you educate women, the size of family shrinks precipitously, like below replacement. And that's partly because women have other options. That's a huge part.
We're seeing this
of it.
play out.
Oh yes, I mean all the countries in the West are way below replacement. Korea's way below replacement. South Korea, Japan, way below replacement.